Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like someone inside was trying to speak to you? Tonight we begin with a faded portrait taken in 1907, two young sisters sitting side by side, dressed in delicate white lace. One stares solemnly into the camera, the other, a 14-year-old girl, flashes a small, curious smile. A smile that will outlast a century of silence. When a historian discovers this forgotten photograph in a dusty archive, she can't know what story it will spark. A story buried in time, forgotten, quietly waiting to be told. What began as a simple restoration of a photograph soon rediscovers a woman whose talent reshaped American education, only to be erased by the very history she helped make. So settle in. Let the silence guide you as we follow the faint trail that confident smile leaves behind, a mystery of identity, memory, and how history chooses who to remember and who to forget. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening tonight? It began quietly in October of 2023. The Connecticut Historical Society received a rather unassuming package from the estate of the late historian, Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. Inside, among boxes of faded papers and the scent of old varnish, lay a small collection of photographs, sepia tones from another century. Scenes of stiff collars and solemn faces. But one photograph in particular caught the attention of museum curator Sarah Chen. It was a formal portrait, carefully mounted and dated 1907. Two young women posed in that meticulous, composed fashion of early 20th century photography. The studio mark along the lower edge read, Hartwell and Associates Photography, New Haven, Connecticut. One of the most prestigious names of its time, favored by families of wealth and social standing. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the image. The older sister sat gracefully in an ornate chair, her dark dress traced with delicate lacework. Her expression calm, almost solemn. The picture of composure that was expected from young women of privilege. Beside her stood a younger girl, perhaps 14 or 15, wearing a lighter dress with embroidered detail that caught the light just so. The two held themselves in that familiar posture of long exposure photography, perfectly still, perfectly formal, perfectly silent. Everything about the image seemed ordinary. The soft sepia, the subtle grain of the paper, the embossed mark of a respected studio, all signs of an expensive commission. Families of their standing often had such portraits made tokens of prosperity and lineage. But as Sarah Chen prepared to catalogue the image for the museum's archives, something stopped her. It was a detail, small, almost imperceptible at first, that would unravel into one of the most fascinating discoveries in the history of American women's education, and the quiet rebellion of a young girl in 1907. Under the cool light of the museum's conservation lab, Chen studied the portrait again. And there, in the faint play of shadow and tone, she noticed something about the younger sister's face. Her expression didn't match the era's rigid expectations. Most portraits from that time were careful masks, faces emptied of emotion, constrained by both the camera's slow shutter and the era's unspoken rules. But this girl, she seemed to resist that silence. Her lips curved just slightly into what could only be described as a smile. Not the stiff, polite curve of etiquette, but something alive. A quiet joy, a spark of knowing. Her eyes met the camera's lens, directly bright and curious, as if she understood the world beyond the frame. Chen leaned closer, The girl's presence radiated intelligence, confidence, even defiance qualities, rare to see captured in the photographs of young women from that era. Her posture, though still formal, felt relaxed, natural. She seemed comfortable in her own skin, aware of herself in a way that women, especially young women, were seldom encouraged to be. The difference between the two sisters became striking. The elder, dignified and composed, embodied every convention of social grace. The younger, meanwhile, seemed to break from it without moving, without speaking, simply through the light in her eyes. Chen began documenting every detail, photographing the portrait at high resolution. Each enlargement deepened the sense that this was no ordinary image. Who was this girl? And what had given her that spark, that audacious hint of freedom in a time when women's futures were so carefully scripted? Curiosity led Chen deeper. She began tracing the photograph's origins, hoping to uncover the identities of the two sisters. What she found would open a door to one of the most remarkable and long-forgotten stories in Connecticut's past. To confirm her suspicions, Chen reached out to Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a Yale historian, who specialized in early 20th century women's education. When Sullivan first saw the portrait, she paused. Even in digital form, the younger sister's expression seemed to break through time. The younger girl's gaze is extraordinary for 1907, Sullivan murmured, studying the image beneath her glasses. Most girls of her age would have been taught to appear subdued, decorative, even passive. But here, she looks alive, intelligent, intentional. Sullivan's insight gave context to what Chen had seen. The early 1900s had been a time of delicate change, a period when a few daring families, quietly defying tradition, began to encourage education for their daughters. But such progress was rare. In Connecticut's wealthier circles, women were still expected to master etiquette before intellect, charm, before curiosity. And yet, somehow, this young girl had been taught to look straight into the lens, to think, not just to pose. What story might her eyes have been trying to tell, and why, after more than a century, was she still smiling at us from that photograph, as though she knew we'd one day find her? The search for the sisters began quietly, with dust and paper. Sarah Chen and Dr. Margaret Sullivan started where all great mysteries begin, with the smallest details. The embossed mark from Hartwell and Associates, the elegant curve of a signature, the cut of a sleeve that might whisper something about its time. Hartwell's studio, as it turned out, had kept meticulous records of its clientele, polished ledgers filled with dates, family names, and commission notes. Many of those books still rested in the New Haven Historical Society, waiting patiently for someone to ask the right questions. Using the studio's records, the photograph's date, and the clear signs of wealth in the sisters' attire, Sullivan began narrowing down possibilities. Connecticut society in 1907 had been a tightly woven circle, its prominent families appearing again and again in the archives like recurring motifs in an old song. The Whitmans, the Morrisons, the Paytons, all had daughters. All had at some point posed before Hartwell's lens. But only one of those families, they would soon learn, had given the world one of its most remarkable young women, a girl whose light had nearly been forgotten beneath the dust of time. Weeks passed in patient research. Chen and Sullivan traced names through city registries, family genealogies, and the fading handwriting of old census records. At last, a breakthrough two names matched every clue Catherine Morrison, aged 19, and Helen Morrison, aged 14, daughters of industrialist Robert Morrison and his wife Elizabeth. The Morrison family had been among New Haven's elite. Their home, an elegant mansion along Prospect Street, was a gathering place for the city's cultured and charitable circles. Robert Morrison owned several manufacturing firms and invested widely across Connecticut industries. By every account, they lived a life of comfort, refinement, and influence. But beneath the polished surface, there was something unusual about them. Something quietly revolutionary. While most wealthy families of their era prepared daughters for polite society and strategic marriages, the Morrisons had chosen a different path. Their letters and records revealed a deep commitment to education, not merely as ornament, but as purpose. Catherine, the elder sister, had been privately tutored in languages, mathematics, and literature. Her education already rivaled that of her male peers. But the real astonishment came with the discovery of her younger sister's schooling. Helen Morrison, the girl with the faint, defiant smile, had been studying for college admission at just 14. At a time when fewer than 2% of American women even dreamed of higher education, she was already preparing to break through the barrier. The family's correspondence with early women's colleges revealed their belief that intellect was not bound by gender. Robert Morrison himself had quietly funded several institutions devoted to women's higher learning, despite public criticism from Connecticut's more conservative circles. As Sullivan pieced the fragments together, a name began to shimmer through the records. A name history had nearly lost. That bright-eyed girl in the portrait would grow into Dr. Helen Morrison Williams, one of the first women ever to earn a doctorate in mathematics from Yale University, and a fierce advocate for women's education across New England. Her story unfolded like a rediscovered melody, familiar and new all at once. Helen's brilliance had revealed itself early. By 16, she entered Vassar College, graduating magna cum laude in 1911 with degrees in both mathematics and classical languages. Her undergraduate thesis, a treatise on geometric theory, was published in a major academic journal, making her one of the youngest women ever recognized at that level of scholarship. But she didn't stop there, defying expectations and rules alike. Helen applied to Yale for graduate study in mathematics, though the university's policy at the time severely restricted women's participation in advanced programs. Her first application was rejected. Most would have stopped there. Helen did not. Through determination, academic brilliance, and her family's influence, she was eventually admitted, one of only 3 women in the program. In 1915, she completed her doctoral dissertation introducing concepts that would decades later echo in the early development of what we now call computer science. Her equations became the quiet roots of progress hidden beneath the soil of time. And yet, for reasons history rarely explains, her name had all but vanished. No portraits in textbooks, no lectures bearing her title. Only this photograph remained a young girl looking calmly, confidently into the future, as if she somehow knew the world would one day remember her. Was that why she smiled? Did she sense, even at 14, that her mind would outlive her era? Sarah Chen couldn't stop thinking about that question. And as she would soon discover, Helen Morrison's story wasn't merely one of brilliance, it was also one of loss resistance and quiet defiance against a world that was not yet ready for her. Helen Morrison Williams's work was in many ways ahead of its century. So far ahead, in fact, that much of it went unrecognized until long after her death, when computer scientists tracing the origins of their field rediscovered her mathematical theories and quietly realized that she had laid early foundations for what would later be called algorithmic thinking. But Helen's mind was never confined to the walls of academia. She believed knowledge carried a moral responsibility, that education, if kept locked in ivory towers, was no better than ignorance. Using her growing influence, she began creating pathways for others. She established scholarships for young women who longed for the kind of education she had fought to obtain. She founded preparatory schools that provided rigorous academic training for girls' schools, where critical thought was encouraged, not punished. And she lobbied state governments to increase funding for women's educational programs, often standing before rooms of skeptical men and arguing with quiet precision that the nation could not progress while half its intellect remained untrained. Her commitment to reform was lifelong. She applied her mathematical expertise not only to theory, but to truth-conducting statistical studies that revealed patterns of inequality in education, employment, and public services. The numbers, she believed, could tell a moral story. And in her hands, they did. Her research became a weapon in the hands of early women's rights advocates. Data that could no longer be dismissed as sentiment or speculation. Through her calculations, lawmakers were forced to see the inequities they had long ignored. The girl who once smiled into a camera's glass had indeed become the woman her expression promised, confident, curious, and unwilling to accept silence where reason could speak. As Sullivan's research deepened, she began to realize something extraordinary. Helen Morrison Williams's influence reached far beyond mathematics or education. Her ideas had rippled through nearly every major social reform movement of her time, though history had failed to leave her name attached. During World War I, Helen had quietly offered her expertise to the US government, volunteering her skills in statistical analysis. Her methods helped optimize the nation's supply distribution, ensuring food equipment and medical aid reached the right places at the right time. It was meticulous, invisible work, the kind that saves lives without ever being credited. Government documents later revealed that officials had relied heavily on her mathematical models. Yet, no medals, no mentions bore her name, and still she continued. In the 1920s, Helen turned her attention toward another cause: racial equality. Using her analytical methods, she began documenting the statistical realities of racial discrimination in education and employment. Her findings became evidence used in early NAACP legal challenges, shaping court decisions that laid the groundwork for later civil rights victories. She was not on the podium, nor in the headlines. But her numbers, cold, clean, irrefutable, helped change the world. Her educational innovations were equally visionary. The preparatory schools she established for girls were decades ahead of their time, emphasizing critical thinking, scientific method, and social responsibility. Ideas that would not become mainstream until the mid-20th century had already taken root in her classrooms long before. Through these institutions, she mentored dozens of young women who would go on to become doctors, lawyers, educators, and reformers in their own right. Many prominent women of the mid-century traced their inspiration directly or indirectly back to Helen, though her name, once again, was seldom recorded beside theirs. The deeper Sullivan read, the clearer the pattern became. Helen had maintained correspondence with some of the most significant intellectuals and reformers of her age. Letters filled with careful reasoning, moral courage, and an unwavering belief that society could be made better through education and empathy. Her ideas had quietly shaped policy debates across New England, influencing how states approached public schooling, labor, and welfare reform. And yet history had all but erased her. Despite her brilliance, despite her measurable impact, Helen Morrison Williams remained a shadow in the records, her name barely mentioned in the same archives that held her discoveries. Her work had been attributed to men she'd assisted or advised. Her equations published under the names of professors who had merely supervised her research. It was not malice perhaps, but a pattern. One repeated so often that it had become invisible. Even newspapers, when they did mention her, chose to focus on her grace, her manners, her status as a lady educator. The substance of her work, the courage of her ideas, the rigor of her mind, those were softened into polite footnotes. Her intellect reduced to charm. The 1907 portrait had captured something that the written record had failed to: the quiet certainty of a girl who already knew she was meant for more. Her eyes, steady and alive, seemed to hold the weight of all she would one day prove, and all the world would forget. Dr. Sullivan's research now told a story that was larger than one woman's life. It was a mirror of how history itself had been written and of who it had chosen to remember. And somewhere in the stillness of the Connecticut Historical Society's archive, that single photograph rested under glass. Once more, a frozen moment of defiance and light, waiting for someone else to notice. Tell me, if you had seen that faint smile, would you have looked closer too? The research began to uncover something quietly unsettling. The realization that Helen Morrison Williams hadn't simply been forgotten by chance. She had been erased carefully and deliberately. Helen had been excluded from the very academic societies and professional organizations that should have carried her name forward. Mathematical associations of the time refused to grant full membership to women, no matter their brilliance. Educational councils treated even the most gifted female educators as mere assistants, denying them a voice in shaping the systems they sustained. And perhaps most painful of all, her own family had helped dim her light. Letters found in private archives revealed the quiet domestic pressures Helen faced. It isn't proper for a lady of our standing to seek public attention, one letter warned. Her relatives feared that ambition, when worn by a woman, might appear unbecoming. So Helen remained confined within polite boundaries, brilliant but unseen. As Sullivan pieced the evidence together, a pattern began to emerge, one larger than Helen herself. Dozens of other women equally remarkable had vanished from the official story of American progress. Their work had shaped science education and reform movements, yet history had folded over them layer by layer. Scholars had unknowingly continued this erasure by relying on official documents, the very ones that had excluded women from the start. The silence became self-perpetuating, but the 1907 portrait had survived. In it, Helen sits poised, her expression confident yet calm eyes steady a faint smile that feels almost prophetic now. That photograph, ignored for a century, had quietly held proof of something radical, the mind of a woman certain of her purpose, long before the world was ready to see her. Through years of research, Sullivan found that Helen's legacy extended far beyond her brief mention in academic footnotes. The teaching philosophies she pioneered, emphasizing scientific reasoning, social awareness, and independent thought, had rippled outward through generations. Her preparatory schools in New England trained hundreds of young women, who then carried her ideas across the country. Each graduate became a quiet torchbearer, reshaping classrooms and communities in ways Helen herself would never live to witness. Her scholarship fund, modestly named and nearly forgotten, had supported over 200 women between 1920 and 1950. Many became the first in their families to attend college, entering medicine, law, education, and social work. Through them, Helen's unseen influence spread, creating a living network of change she had set in motion decades earlier. Even her mathematical methods, statistical models she designed to expose inequities in education, became foundational tools in modern policy reform. Those equations, once dismissed as domestic curiosities, would later inform federal studies on school funding and equal opportunity. And though her name had rarely appeared in public record, Helen's correspondence revealed quiet involvement in education policy, advising state boards, guiding reformers, even influencing legislation that demanded equal access to higher education for women. Her ideas, once considered too idealistic, became cornerstones of what we now think of as modern liberal arts education learning that nurtures both intellect and conscience. That faint, confident smile in the old portrait, perhaps it had been more than youthful pride. Perhaps she knew that somewhere, someday, the truth would be found. When Sullivan and Chen's research was finally published, it ignited something remarkable. Universities, women's organizations, and education advocates across the country rallied to restore Helen Morrison Williams to her rightful place in history. Her name, once buried under decades of polite neglect, began to resurface, whispered first in academic halls, then spoken aloud in classrooms, lectures, and ceremonies. And as her portrait was unveiled once again under the soft light of a museum gallery, visitors lingered before it, wondering perhaps how many other faces in history had smiled like that, knowing something the world had yet to remember. It soon became clear that Helen Morrison Williams had not been forgotten by accident, she had been erased. The research revealed how Helen was deliberately kept out of the professional and academic circles that would have given her the recognition she so deeply deserved. Mathematical societies at the turn of the century quietly barred women from full membership regardless of brilliance or merit. Educational organizations placed women in auxiliary roles, ensuring that even the most gifted minds remained unseen, unheard, and uncredited. But the most painful discovery came from much closer to home. Helen's own family, her parents, siblings, even close friends had often discouraged her from seeking public recognition. In their letters, Sullivan found delicate but chilling words of restraint. "A lady of our class must not draw attention to herself," one read. "Your work is admirable, Helen, but best appreciated quietly." To them, ambition was unbecoming. Achievement, if feminine, was something to hide. As Sullivan followed these threads, a broader pattern began to emerge, one woven through decades of silence. Helen was not alone. Dozens of women from her era, equally accomplished, had suffered the same quiet vanishing. Their work had shaped education, science, and reform movements, yet the record books had folded neatly over their names. historians relying on official documents that had excluded women from the start had unintentionally preserved the erasure. And so, generation after generation, the silence endured. But the 1907 portrait had survived a single moment that refused to disappear. There she was, Helen Morrison Williams, seated with an air of composure and intelligence that seemed to transcend her time. The faint smile, so subtle yet unmistakably confident, now carried new weight. It had taken more than a century for anyone to understand what that photograph had truly captured, not just a likeness, but defiance. As Sullivan's research deepened, Helen's legacy grew brighter. Her teaching methods centered on critical thinking, scientific reasoning, and social awareness had quietly shaped classrooms across New England. The preparatory school she founded had educated hundreds of young women, many of whom became teachers, reformers, and administrators who carried Helen's philosophy into communities across the country. Her ideas had traveled far, changing American education from the inside out. Even after her passing, her influence continued. The Helen Williams Scholarship, begun humbly in the 1920s, helped more than 200 women pursue college degrees, many the first in their families to do so. Some became doctors, lawyers, educators, social workers, all part of an unspoken sisterhood bound by Helen's belief in women's intellect and independence. And then came another revelation: Helen had been a mathematician as well as an educator. The statistical tools she developed to study educational inequality later became standard across the country. Those same methods guided mid-century policy reforms, helping shape public funding and expand access to higher education. Her reach extended even further. Letters and correspondence revealed that Helen had quietly advised lawmakers and education leaders, not through title or office, but through sheer influence. She helped push for equal university access, inspired the founding of women's colleges, and shaped legislation that gave countless women the right to learn freely. Though her name had rarely been printed in the history books, Helen's ideas lived on, embedded in the very framework of modern liberal arts education. She believed that learning should cultivate both the mind and the conscience, that knowledge without empathy was incomplete. That belief, radical in her day, remains the heart of American education, and perhaps that's what her smile had always meant. Not pride, but quiet foresight. A knowing expression from a woman certain that truth, however long buried, would one day surface. When Sullivan and Chen finally shared their findings, the story of Helen Morrison Williams spread far beyond academic journals. Universities, women's organizations, and educators across the country joined the effort to restore her rightful place in history. Exhibitions were held, her portrait displayed once again, this time under warm light, surrounded by the names of those she had unknowingly inspired. For the first time in more than a century, Helen's voice was heard. And perhaps if you look at that portrait now, into those calm, unyielding eyes, you might feel what Sullivan did, that she's still speaking, still teaching, still waiting to be remembered. When the story of Helen Morrison Williams finally surfaced, it did more than restore a single name to history. It set off a quiet revolution. In the spring that followed Sullivan and Chen's discovery, the Connecticut Historical Society opened a grand exhibition titled Hidden Pioneers, Forgotten Women Who Shaped American Education. At its heart stood the 1907 portrait, the same photograph that had years before whispered its quiet mystery to Sarah Chen beneath the glow of a restoration lamp. Now displayed under glass and soft light, the image drew thousands of visitors who came to meet the gaze of a 14-year-old girl whose smile had waited more than a century to be understood. Surrounding the portrait were letters, research notes, school ledgers and mathematical manuscripts, fragments of a life once overlooked, now fully illuminated. Visitors could trace Helen's journey from an ambitious student at Yale to a visionary reformer whose ideas had shaped education itself. Yale University, recognizing at last the magnitude of her contributions, established the Helen Morrison Williams Fellowship, funding women pursuing graduate work in mathematics and educational research. The fellowship specifically supported projects in equity and reform, continuing the work Helen had begun generations earlier. Across New England schools that Helen herself had founded, quiet brick buildings that had once trained young women in science and reason held commemorative events. Their archives revealed decades of records linking directly back to Helen's teachings. For the first time, plaques bearing her name appeared in hallways where her influence had never been publicly acknowledged. The Mathematical Association of America, after a century of silence, conducted a full review of her published work. They confirmed what Sullivan had long suspected. Helen's mathematical writings, especially her early papers on logic and sequence patterns, had anticipated core ideas of algorithmic computation. Her 1907 dissertation, long hidden in university archives, was republished with modern commentary. Scholars described it as a foundation stone of theoretical computer science decades before the field existed. Women's organizations across New England raised funds to restore her gravesite and mark the places where she had lived, taught, and written. Small bronze plaques began to appear on ivy-covered walls near weathered gates beside old schoolhouses, each inscribed with her name, her years, and one quiet phrase she taught others to think. The wave of recognition did not stop with Helen. Her rediscovery opened doors to a much larger reckoning, one that reached into archives across the country. Universities began forming dedicated programs to uncover other forgotten women whose contributions had been erased from the official record. What began as one woman's story became a movement to restore balance to the pages of history. Media outlets drawn by the quiet power of Helen's legacy carried the story nationwide. Her portrait appeared in newspapers and documentaries, always with that same steady smile, a symbol of brilliance that refused to be silenced. 3 years after Sarah Chen first paused before that faded photograph, the world had changed. Helen Morrison Williams had become an icon. Her portrait now hangs in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, part of the permanent exhibition, Hidden Figures: Women Who Changed America. Millions of visitors each year stop to study it, some leaning close as if the girl in the picture might whisper her secret. Dr. Sullivan's biography, The Confident Smile. Helen Morrison Williams and the Hidden History of Women's Education became required reading in universities across the country. It reshaped how scholars approach women's history, not as a series of footnotes, but as a story waiting patiently beneath the surface of the familiar. Yale established the Helen Morrison Williams Archives, preserving her correspondence lecture notes and early drafts of her research. Graduate students now travel from around the world to study them, tracing her influence through education, mathematics, and social reform. Educators inspired by her work began adapting her teaching philosophy, one that joined critical thinking with moral awareness. School districts across the United States quietly reintroduced her methods, teaching children not only how to reason but why reasoning mattered. For the Morrison family, the rediscovery brought both pride and reflection. They established the Helen Morrison Foundation, offering scholarships for women pursuing studies in mathematics education and social reform. A living continuation of the legacy she began more than a century earlier. And so, the portrait remains serene, timeless, unassuming, a reminder that history often hides its most important truths in plain sight. Look closely, and you might see what Sarah Chen saw: a quiet confidence that refused to yield. Helen's smile was not just the expression of a young girl in 1907, it was the trace of something larger. The reflection of every woman whose achievements were dismissed, whose names were misplaced, whose brilliance still flickers in forgotten letters and yellowed pages. Today, when visitors stand before that portrait in the museum's gentle light, they no longer see just two well-dressed sisters. They see a century's worth of possibility, of minds unrecorded, of stories waiting to be found. And perhaps if you linger there a moment longer, you'll feel it too, that quiet insistence that history isn't finished, that it's still waiting, still listening, still ready to be rewritten. So tell me, if you happened upon an old photo like Sarah's, what details would draw you in? What stories might still be hidden there, waiting for someone like you to recognize them? And if this is your first time hearing this tonight, welcome to Sleepy History Tales, where forgotten lives breathe again in the silence of the night.